Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever wondered why some people never seem to let go, no matter how far you walk away? Why certain souls linger in someone's mind long after the relationship ends, leaving confusion, pain, or even fascination behind? Today, I'm going to reveal the truth. The real reason narcissists stay obsessed with some people and not others. This isn't about weakness or failure. This is about power, authenticity, and the irreplaceable light that shines in those who refuse to be small. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll see obsession in a completely different way. Narcissists don't obsess over everyone, and that truth alone can be deeply unsettling once you understand it. Their fixation is selective, intentional, and rooted in something far deeper than attraction or attachment. They become obsessed only with people who awaken what they themselves do not possess. At their core, narcissists suffer from an internal emptiness, a fractured sense of self that relies on external reflection to feel real. When they encounter someone who is grounded, emotionally alive, and authentic, it triggers both desire and threat at the same time. These individuals carry a natural sense of identity. They know who they are, even if they're still growing. They feel deeply, express honestly, and exist without constantly performing for approval. This authenticity acts like a mirror, reflecting back to the narcissist the absence within themselves. What they see is not admiration, it's exposure. The narcissist recognizes something they desperately want but cannot genuinely develop. That recognition turns into obsession. It's not love that keeps them fixated, it's the longing to absorb what they lack. They attempt to possess the person's energy, confidence, empathy, and emotional stability, hoping it will fill the void inside them. But because that void is structural, nothing ever satisfies it. The more real the other person is, the more intense the fixation becomes. What truly deepens the obsession is when the person remains themselves without seeking validation. Independence, self-respect, and inner peace act like a silent provocation. The narcissist cannot manipulate what is internally anchored, and that inability feels like a personal failure. Obsession grows where control fails. In this way, the fixation is not about who the other person is doing, but who they are being. The narcissist is drawn to the life force, the emotional wholeness, and the quiet self-trust they cannot manufacture. And that contrast between fullness and emptiness becomes the reason they cannot let go. And this is where the truth gets even more uncomfortable, because once you understand why they fixate, you must also understand what that fixation actually is. It feels intense. It feels personal. Sometimes it even feels like love, but it isn't. What they experience is not devotion, it is hunger. A narcissist does not love in the way a whole person loves. Love requires presence, empathy, and the ability to see another human as separate from yourself. What they feel instead is a pull toward reflection. You became a mirror that made them feel significant, powerful, and seen. When you were close, they borrowed your sense of worth. When you pulled away, they felt themselves fading. That is why the obsession doesn't calm with reassurance. It escalates, because no amount of attention ever satisfies a void that has no bottom. They are not chasing you. They are chasing the version of themselves they believed they were when they were reflected in your eyes. Control is the glue that holds this obsession together. If they can predict you, influence you, or provoke you, they can still feel connected to that borrowed identity. That's why they test boundaries. That's why they rewrite history. That's why they hover, disappear, reappear, and circle back long after the relationship should have ended. It isn't romance, it's regulation. And here's the most painful part for many people to accept. Your pain was not proof of love. Your exhaustion was not evidence of connection. It was the cost of being used as an emotional resource. You were supplying something vital, validation, stability, meaning, without realizing you were never being met in return. Once you see this clearly, something shifts. The obsession loses its power over you because you realize they were never trying to love you. They were trying to consume what you carried. And this is where the story turns inward, because once you understand that the obsession was about hunger, you begin to see why you were chosen, not randomly, not by accident, but because of who you are at your core. Narcissists stay obsessed with people who are deeply empathetic, emotionally intelligent, and profoundly human. People who listen with their whole presence. People who feel the weight of others' emotions without being asked. You didn't just hear them, you saw them. And for someone who has spent a lifetime hiding behind masks, that kind of attention feels like oxygen. You carried warmth into rooms without trying to dominate them. You had the rare ability to hold space, not to fix, not to control, but to understand. That made them feel important, understood, even special. But what they mistook for connection was actually your capacity for compassion. You offered depth in a world where they survived on performance. This is why they gravitated towards you again and again. Your authenticity was steady. Your care was consistent. Your emotional availability made them feel safe enough to unload their chaos, to air insecurities, their hidden shame. You became the place where their fragments could temporarily rest. But empathy without reciprocity slowly becomes erosion. Each time you explained instead of being heard, each time you gave the benefit of the doubt, each time you carried emotional weight that wasn't yours, you were pouring from a well they never learned to refill. And still, you stayed human, you stayed kind, you stayed real. That is what kept them hooked. Because while they needed you to survive emotionally, you never needed them to know who you were. You brought love without losing identity. And to someone who defines themselves through others, that is both irresistible and unbearable. So their obsession grew, not because you were weak, but because you were whole. And eventually something shifts. The empathy that once made you accessible begins to stand upright. The understanding that once bent now finds its spine. Because people like you don't stay emptying themselves forever. You start to choose yourself, and that moment, quiet, firm, unapologetic, is where the obsession sharpens. Narcissists are not triggered by weakness. They are triggered by strength that no longer asks for permission. When you begin to set boundaries, not in anger but in clarity, it destabilizes everything they relied on. Your no becomes louder than any argument. Your calm becomes more threatening than confrontation. Because boundaries announce something dangerous to them, you are no longer available to be consumed. This is when fixation intensifies. Not because they want closeness, but because they feel control slipping through their fingers. Strength in you reflects deficiency in them. Your self-respect becomes a spotlight on their manipulation. Your consistency exposes their chaos. And instead of inspiring growth, it ignites resentment. What they cannot dominate, they attempt to destabilize. So they push, they test, they provoke reactions, hoping to pull you back into emotional entanglement. But the more grounded you become, the less power those tactics hold. And that imbalance, your stability versus their internal disorder, becomes unbearable. Here's the paradox. The healthier you grow, the more obsessed they become. Not because they want you back, but because your wholeness confirms what they fear most, that you never needed to break to be loved, and they never learned how to love without breaking someone. Your strength becomes the final mirror, one that reflects truth without cruelty, and they can't look away. So if their presence grew louder when you became quieter, if their behavior escalated when you stopped explaining, understand this: it wasn't punishment, it was panic, because strength that cannot be controlled becomes unforgettable. And when control is gone, something deeper begins to surface, something they spend their entire lives trying to outrun. Because what truly haunts a narcissist is not your absence, but what your absence reveals. You see, they can steal attention, they can borrow confidence, they can mimic charm and success, but there are certain things they can never take from you, no matter how long they watched you, studied you, or tried to break you down. They cannot steal your identity. They cannot replicate your integrity. They cannot manufacture your inner peace. And that is what keeps them awake. Your identity was never built on applause. It came from lived experience, values, and self-awareness. Even when you doubted yourself, there was still a core that knew right from wrong, truth from illusion. That core terrified them because it could not be manipulated without resistance. Your integrity made them uneasy. You meant what you said. You felt guilt when you caused harm. You took responsibility. For someone who survives by rewriting narratives and avoiding accountability, this kind of moral consistency feels like exposure. You didn't need to accuse them. Your existence already told the truth. And then there was your peace, not the loud kind. The quiet, grounded steadiness that returned once you stepped away. That peace became proof that their power was an illusion. If you could heal without them, if you could smile without their validation, if your life could expand instead of collapse, then their control was never real. This is why they watch from a distance, why they resurface unexpectedly, why they try to remind you of who you used to be with them. They are chasing what the E lost access to, not who you were. Because the most painful realization for them is this: you walked away with everything that mattered, and they were left alone with themselves. And that is the obsession they can't escape. And this is where the power quietly changes hands. Because the moment you stop trying to be understood by them, something inside the dynamic collapsed. You didn't announce it. You didn't threaten it. You simply withdrew your need for their approval. And that absence spoke louder than any final argument ever could. When you stopped chasing validation, the script flipped. The roles reversed. What once felt like distance to you felt like abandonment to them. Not because they lost love, but because they lost their mirror. Without your reactions, your explanations, your emotional labor, they were forced to sit with themselves. And that is a place they avoid at all costs. Your silence was not punishment, it was self-respect. But to a narcissist, it felt like erasure. They had built their sense of importance around your attention. Every response reassured them they still mattered. When those responses disappeared, panic set in. Not longing, panic. That's why they suddenly want closure, suddenly want to talk, suddenly want to understand you. It's not curiosity, it's supply withdrawal. You didn't become mysterious, you became unavailable. And nothing triggers obsession faster than access being revoked without explanation. The chase begins where afar oval ends, because as long as you were seeking their validation, they held power. The moment you no longer needed it, you reclaimed yourself. And self-possession is the one thing they cannot compete with. This is the irony they never see coming. The less you care about being chosen, the more they fixate on choosing you. Not to love you, but to restore the imbalance, to feel significant again, to confirm they still exist in your emotional world. But you don't owe them that confirmation. Because the most radical act of freedom is realizing you were always enough, even when they stopped applauding. And when you no longer respond, something unexpected happens. The silence begins to speak for you. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a weight that no explanation ever carried. Because silence, to a narcissist, is not empty. It is threatening. Confrontation gives them something to grip. Anger gives them fuel. Even tears give them relevance. But silence removes the stage entirely. When you stop engaging, when you don't defend your truth or correct their version of the story, you take away the one thing they rely on to feel powerful: reaction. This is where obsession deepens. They replay conversations in their mind, searching for a thread they can pull. They revisit memories, not out of nostalgia, but confusion. Your quiet withdrawal becomes louder than any goodbye because it denies them resolution. And without resolution, control collapses. Silence says, I no longer need you to understand me. Silence says, your perception no longer defines me. Silence says, I have already moved on. And that is unbearable. Because narcissists regulate their emotions externally. They need feedback to stabilize their sense of self. When you disappear emotionally, even if you're physically gone, the feedback loop breaks. They don't miss you, they miss the effect they had on you. This is why they provoke. They send subtle messages. They reappear under the guise of concern, nostalgia, or unfinished business. They are not reaching for connection. They are testing whether silence still holds. And if you don't answer, the obsession grows sharper, not because they love you more, but because they can't locate themselves in your absence. Your quiet strength becomes a mirror they can't control, a reminder that life continues without their permission. In the end, silence doesn't just end the dynamic, it exposes it. And once exposed, it can never return to what it was. That's why silence is the loudest boundary you ever set. And beneath all of that silence, beneath the obsession and the reaching and the restless circling, there is something far more fragile driving it all, something they rarely allow themselves to feel, let alone face: shame, not the kind that teaches growth, but the kind that corrodes, the kind that whispers, something is wrong with me, and then buries that truth under grandiosity, blame, and performance. When you stepped away, when why, oh, stopped reacting, that buried voice grew louder. Your absence didn't just remove supply, it removed distraction. Because without you there to absorb their projections, they were left alone with the fear of being seen for who they really are: empty, inconsistent, unhealed. You didn't need to accuse them. Your silence already exposed the truth they spend their lives running from. This is why obsession lingers long after the relationship ends. It isn't about reconciliation, it's about unfinished emotional business inside them. You became the last person who saw behind the mask and walked away anyway. That cuts deeper than rejection ever could. They fear you because you hold evidence of who they were, not the image, but the reality. And the idea that someone could know them at that level and still choose distance activates profound insecurity. If you could leave, then the illusion of superiority collapses. So they rewrite the story. They villainize you. They minimize what you meant. But behind all of that narrative control is one unshakable fear that you saw the truth and survived it. Your existence becomes a threat because it disproves their false self. You are living proof that their charm was not power, their control was not love, and their mask was not enough. And that shame, unprocessed, unhealed, is what keeps the obsession alive. And this is where many people turn that shame inward, even after they've walked away. They replay the moments they were told they were. Air too emotional, too sensitive, too intense, too much. The words linger, the labels stick. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin to question the very qualities that made them human. But here is the truth that changes everything. You were never too much. You were simply standing in front of someone who was too empty. Your depth felt overwhelming because they lived on the surface. Your emotional honesty felt chaotic because they survived on avoidance. Your need for clarity felt demanding because they depended on confusion to maintain control. What they called too much was actually too real for someone who could only function behind a mask. When you expressed needs, it wasn't neediness, it was self-awareness. When you asked for accountability, it wasn't criticism, it was integrity. When you loved fully, it wasn't intensity, it was courage. But to someone who feared exposure, those qualities felt like pressure. So they shrank you with language. They minimized your feelings. They framed your humanity as a flaw so they wouldn't have to face their own emotional limitations. And for a while, you may have believed them. You may have tried to quiet yourself, soften your edges, carry less truth. But notice what happened when you left. Your light didn't disappear. Your emotions didn't destroy you. Your voice didn't ruin your life. You became clearer, lighter, more yourself. That's how you know the problem was never your depth. It was their inability to meet it. You weren't asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person. And once you reclaim that truth, their narrative loses its grip because you finally see your authenticity was never the issue. It was the reason you survived. And when that realization settles in, not intellectually, but deep in your body, something powerful happens. You stop needing their behavior to make sense. You stop searching for validation in their confusion because you finally understand that their obsession was never evidence of your failure. It was proof of your power. Healing doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, the moment you stop interpreting their fixation as something you did wrong. The moment you see it clearly, they clung because you represented what they could not build inside themselves. Your presence challenged their false self. Your departure confirmed it. Their obsession was never about keeping you small. It was about surviving your clarity. And when you understand that, the shame dissolves. The self-doubt loosens its grip. You stop asking, "What was wrong with me?" and start recognizing, "Nothing was ever missing in me." The obsession becomes contextual, not personal, informational, not defining. You see now that being unforgettable to someone who cannot love is not a curse. It's a consequence of having substance, of having a soul that doesn't bend itself into survival shapes, of choosing truth over performance, even when it costs you connection. Healing is realizing that you don't need to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding themselves. It's knowing that walking away didn't make you cold, it made you whole. It's recognizing that peace feels unfamiliar at first because chaos once convinced you it was passion. And perhaps the most freeing truth of all is this: you don't need to be obsessed over to be valuable. You don't need to be remembered by someone broken to know your worth. Their fixation was a shadow cast by your light, but you were never meant to live in someone else's darkness. You were meant to move forward, carrying everything they could never take, and finally belong to yourself. And this brings us to the most important truth of all, the one that transforms obsession from a source of pain into a mirror of your own power. Because once you understand everything we've explored, the hunger, the mirrors, the fixation, the silence, the shame, you realize that their obsession is not a reflection of your flaws. It is a reflection of your strength. The only people narcissists stay obsessed with are those who refuse to shrink, who refuse to bend, who refuse to over their identity. Their fixation is the loudest signal that you carried something they could not touch: authenticity, integrity, and a sense of self that does not depend on approval. And while it may have been exhausting to witness or endure, it is proof that you never lost yourself, even when they tried to define you. Your power is inherent. It is not given, borrowed, or dependent on anyone else's recognition. The fact that they cannot forget you, cannot control you, and cannot replicate what you brought into the relationship is evidence that you were whole, even when the world told you otherwise. You were the one living truthfully while they were living theatrically. You were the one anchored while they floated in a sea of pretense. And this is the liberating realization. Obsession is not a validation of their love. It is a testament to your resilience. It proves that you existed fully, bravely, and unapologetically. It proves that your life and your identity are yours alone, untouchable, and unborrowable. So when you feel the echo of their attention, do not feel small, do not feel guilty, do not feel broken. Let it remind you instead, you were never the problem. You were the example. You were the standard they could never reach. And the only reason they stay obsessed is because you became everything they could never be. You are enough. You always were. And you always will be. And now, as we come to the end of this journey together, I want you to hold on to one truth. That will transform the way you see yourself and everyone who ever tried to dim your light. The story of narcissistic obsession is not a story about you being broken. It is a story about someone else being incomplete. And once you understand that, everything changes. You are not too emotional, too sensitive, too intense, or too much. You were human. You were alive. You were whole in a world that tried to convince you that your humanity was a flaw. The obsession you endured, the attention you lost sleep over, the confusion and heartbreak, all of it points to one undeniable fact: you were never small. You were always bigger than the reflection they wanted to steal, bigger than the control they wanted to wield, bigger than the illusion they tried to build around you. And here's the most powerful thing: the energy they spent on you, the fixation they carried, the obsession they couldn't shake, it all proves your worth, your presence, and your unshakable truth. While they were chasing control, you were building freedom. While they were haunted by what they could not have, you were reclaiming who you were meant to be. So when you walk away from their shadows, carry this with you. Their obsession does not define you, it highlights you. Their inability to let go is proof of your power. Their fixation is a reflection of your authenticity, your integrity, and your courage to live fully without apology. And now, the real gift is this: your life is no longer theirs to chase. Your joy is no longer dependent on their recognition. Your identity is untouchable. You are free. You are enough. You are unforgettable, not for them, but for the world, and most importantly, for yourself. Remember this always: being unforgettable is not a curse, it is your triumph. Your story is yours, and your power is undeniable.